Let me give you very briefly the main points I would like you to remember. Very likely I won't be able to finish this in any case. Point number one, there has been, in the last 30-35 years, a huge total debt bubble. By total, I mean public and private, and growing since the 80s, and it burst, the final version of it burst in 2008. This has been accompanying an implicit promise of higher standards of living through large market deregulation experiments, chief among them capital markets, financial markets deregulation, and capital mobility. The path chosen for delivering on this implicit promise was debt accumulation. This debt-based road to growth raised the weight, power, risk-taking, and returns to the finance as a sector. The larger the weight, the centrality of finance, the more likely it has become that when the lean cow years would come in, the losses would become of finance in the financial sector would become socialized, whereas the benefits have always been, of course, private. Moreover, this process has exacerbated inequality trends. It has exacerbated, in the sense, it has widened the gaps, has made, as we just heard, the world less equal. Moreover, what we have seen in the post-2008 situation is the coexistence, the moving in together of rising inequality and diminishing growth prospects, which in a sense negates the traditional dilemma of growth, efficiency if you will, on the one hand, versus distributional goals, equality, more equality on the other hand. These were traditionally seen as sitting on the horns of a dilemma. What we are seeing in the last few years may be denying the very existence of this dilemma. Finally, the last point I would like to remember is that the centrality and the boosting of the role of finance in the last 3 decades has siphoned away talent from other occupations, from the real side of the economy, which in a sense has been undercutting the very promise on which debt is built. The only reason why it makes sense to accumulate debt is because you expect changes in terms of technical progress that will boost total factor productivity and will make the implicit bet you are making when you're accumulating debt to pay off, because there will be growth in the real economy. The more you siphon away talent from occupations that can boost technical progress towards the financial sector, the less likely it becomes that the very bet on which finance sits will actually be realized. So, on to the paper. Hope you remember those 4 points. The crisis that we've seen, the euro area crisis in particular, has 3 levels of analysis that are necessary to understand the crisis and possible ways out of it. We usually focus on one of the 3. The one of the 3 that we focus on is the national level. What this country has done wrong, what that country has done wrong. It makes sense to do that. When I make similar speeches in Greece, I always say the following. It doesn't make sense here, but in Greece it does. That no matter how much you accuse others of your problems, you should always have your fiscal house in order, or try to do that. I guess it applies to Portugal too and other countries. The first one is the euro architecture level, the European Monetary Union. There are basic problems, and I should repeat something that I said yesterday, I haven't said it today. I express entirely personal views here. What I say does not in any way reflect the official stance of the European Commission on any of these issues. There were problems with the European Monetary Union and its architecture, very evident to many of us already since the late 80s, early 90s, when this was began to be discussed, or the late 90s, by which time it was becoming a reality. The hope was that either the sort of challenges to the monetary union would put to bear, bring out in the open its structural problems, either those challenges would never materialize, or somehow the problems would be dealt with if they did materialize. Those challenges basically had to do with the following. They had to do with how you deal once you relinquish monetary policy and exchange rate policy, they go together, to a European central bank, to a new entity away from each individual country. How do you deal with asymmetric shocks? Asymmetric shocks are shocks that hit one or a few countries, but not necessarily all of the countries at the same time. If you have a pan-European recession, it's not a problem really. You know how to deal with that, and you deal with that with traditional monetary instruments. The European Central Bank will do that. The problem is when you have problems hitting one or two or a few countries, but not necessarily the others. And this is what we've been witnessing the last few years. The third level is the global level, beyond the European Union. It has to do with the origins of the crisis in the US largely. It has to do with the role of finance. I will speak a little bit about that third level. The role of finance is important for a few reasons that I will suggest here. And the first one is that the financial origin recessions or depressions are much harder to overcome than the standard sort of recession, like the one we had in the early 80s or early 90s in most of Europe and in the US. Second, because the reason for that is obvious. You have a deleveraging process that is very painful. Credibility, on which credit, linguistically speaking, even you can see that credibility is at the root of credit, is undermined in those periods, etc., etc. It takes a long time to get out of these recessions. Second, because of the centrality of finance. In many ways, finance is at the heart, or the heart, is the heart that is pumping blood, pumping liquidity through the system. So it is, to quip here, tongue-in-cheek, it is important to listen to your heart. Because, you may want to listen to your heart in order to avoid future heart attacks. Third, because the size of finance has become enormous. In the US, in which I've seen numbers, the size of the finance sector in the US economy went from about 10 to 11% in the years before, in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, up to 21% in the year before the crisis. In the year before the crisis, finance accounted for more than 40% of corporate profits in the US. These are enormous percentages, enormous figures. Never even imagined before the 80s. Third, because, as I said, the total debt assumed, private and public, went to very high levels, from about 160% of GDP in 1980, the average of OECD countries, to 322% of GDP in 2010. That includes the average of countries, so it includes countries in crisis as well as countries that were not in crisis. Now, this has become that evident that even the IMF is becoming aware of it. I was surprised to find out, doing research before writing this, that there are working papers in the research department of the IMF that they never percolate to the operational side of the IMF. That's the problem. But on the research side, the IMF staff are very good and they realize things. So there are working papers, I found one dating back from 2012, that suggest that you can have something called, actually they title this, or the subtitle is Too Much Finance. That initially, when you liberalize finance, you have a positive effect as finance expands and addresses pent-up demand. But there is a point beyond which continued financial development has no positive impact. And the authors identify that area there as the point where credit to the private sector reaches about 100 or 110% of GDP, which is a point that many EU countries have already reached quite some time ago. Now, reining financing is not easy, will not be easy, and will not be painless. There are already many efforts to re-regulate areas of financial activity. They fail in ways that often are surprising, or they don't deliver on their promise, at least. I would submit largely because one of the things that need to be done has not been done, which is to change the incentives for the managers that make these decisions in finance. This will have to go through touching or affecting their remuneration. To put it very bluntly, finance needs to go back to being an attractive profession the way it was attractive back in the 50s or 60s. Not the way it has been since the 80s. Not the royal type of attractiveness that it has had in the last 30 years. I'll give you an example. Regulation or re-regulation initiatives fail. Derivatives, for instance. In the US, they tried to regulate derivatives, and what they did, they introduced the concept of clearing houses and boards of clearing houses to regulate, especially over-the-counter derivatives. So what happened was the key banks got on the boards of those clearing houses, envisaged by the new regulation. They merged them. They created a very large dominant clearing house, started pushing aside the small clearing houses that emerged or were still present, and created an entity, a private firm, a gatekeeper firm called Market, which holds the rights to certain derivatives indices. Only that firm has those rights. And that firm is under the umbrella of the boards of those clearing houses. So in a sense, they've taken the regulatory effort, they've turned it on its head, and they control that area even more so than they did before. That's why I'm saying that you listen, the standard retort when somebody makes a statement, the sort of statements I'm making here is that, oh, come on, there have been all kinds of new regulatory efforts. Look at the acts in the US. Look at the efforts in Europe. Unless you go to the heart of the matter, they can be very easy to turn on their head. Now, part of what needs to be done likely will involve closing or at least throwing some sand on the wheels of the revolving door between finance and policy making. You have politicians, financiers becoming, more so in the US, I guess, but increasingly also in Europe, becoming policymakers and then going back into finance and vice versa. So that needs somehow to be more seriously regulated. Also, reintroducing the Glass-Steagall Act type regulations, limitations, that were there until 1999, 2000 in the US, and they were repealed by the Clinton administration, by the way. It may make sense to reintroduce them or think very seriously about introducing them. And perhaps even going to the level of considering the breakup of very large firms, the too large and too interconnected to fail sort of firms, the way it was done with Standard Oil in the early 20th century and with AT&T in the 80s in the US. Now, I mentioned inequality. Now, the socializing of huge losses, when finally you take bets, lean cow years come along, your bets go sour, somebody has to pay, somebody has to foot the bill. In the old days, meaning 19th century capitalism or up until the 30s, banks were like other enterprises. They could do very well a few years, or they could fail. What we saw happening repeatedly in the 1870s, 1890s in the US, and in Europe, I think similarly, and more famously, notoriously in the 30s with the Great Depression, is that you cannot treat banks as any other firm. They can start collapsing and they can cause such damage to the entire fabric of the economy and society that you simply cannot allow this to happen. So when this happens, with good reason, government coffers come in and they provide, meaning the taxpayers basically, they provide the funding to salvage the system. When you have benefits privatized and losses socialized, that in itself undermines a very basic promise of capitalism, that you reap your just rewards. This in itself is a huge problem for the system as a whole. But in any case, moreover, what it does, especially as we just heard by the previous speaker, the weight falls largely, the austerity measures fall largely on the shoulders of those with immobile capital. Those with highly mobile capital usually can escape this austerity period, largely unscathed. But those large parts of the population that either don't have much or what they have is immobile, there the brunt of the adjustment falls on them. And that makes inequality increase even more during these periods. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you have in the last few years rising inequality and diminishing growth prospects. In the sense that in Europe in particular, the recovery has been very anemic and it has been faltering. It starts and stops. Unlike the US, it has to do with the different policies that have been followed on the other side of the Atlantic. The good news, this is very bad news of course, but the good news, if there is any glitter of good news there, is that perhaps this dilemma we have always been presented with. Look, if you want more equality, you have to accept less efficiency and less growth. And vice versa. If you want more efficiency or more growth, more dynamism in the economy and all that, well, you have to accept less equality. We are seeing a situation where the two do not seem to be on opposite horns of a dilemma. And it may have to do with something that notoriously Larry Summers, former US Treasury Secretary, identified 2 or 3 years ago. That for all the hype, growth in those 30 years, debt-based growth, debt-driven growth, has not been all that much, has not been all that great. He said that with respect to the credit needed to finance it, nominal demand grew at roughly 5% annually, despite annual credit growth of 10% or more. Now, what he saw, he was talking about the US, of course, but if you see it in other countries, you see that happening too. You see that in the beginning, an extra buck of credit can generate, an X percentage of growth. The more you continue building on this, building your extra growth on extra debt, the return you have, the extra bang for the buck you have, is substantially lower and lower and lower. And what has happened, very likely, is that the increasing inequality has, in a sense, undermined the pump through which growth has operated, which is the savings, investment, consumption pump. Wealthy people save a lot. Poorer people don't have that much to save. What you used to have is that the savings of the wealthier people would, through the banking system, help finance investment and finance consumption and investment by poorer people. As long as technical progress, remember I mentioned technical progress some time ago, is there and continues being there, you can have real growth in the real economy that can help make everybody better off. The banks get money for this facilitating intermediation service they provide. The wealthy people who have provided their savings for this operation get the return with interest, and the poorer people get enough of a boost in their income so that they can repay their debt. The inequality, rising inequality has broken down in a sense, or has undermined the operation of this problem. So we need to revisit this more carefully. And again, even the IMF is aware of this. I saw a paper the research department of the IMF produced in early 2014, where they come up with a surprising, for the IMF at least, conclusion that income equality is not inimical to growth. These are their words. It is even protective of growth. It can even be protective of growth, which I found very interesting. So, going back to the technical progress, it may make sense to start focusing on the technical progress boosting policies if we are to have the pump up and running again. And such policies have to do with technological innovation, pushing the production possibility frontier, and one of the policies that my colleagues and I have worked on the Commission, I mentioned it yesterday, the smart specialization strategies policies that the Commission is adopting for the regional development, the structural funds. Not necessarily for the Juncker plan, by the way. Let me close, just one more minute, with the last item that I mentioned in the four items that I mentioned at the beginning, which has to do with the importance of realizing that finance has been siphoning off, and is siphoning off still today, talent from other occupations more closer to technical progress boosting sort of activities. And there is some evidence for that. It's a controversial statement, of course, it's an avenue for research, but there is some evidence for that, that increasingly you have the way Stiglitz put it in a very impressive, sort of eye-catching way. In 2010, he said, the Nobel Prize winner, Stiglitz, I saw too many of our best students going into finance. They couldn't resist the megabucks. And I have 2 or 3 statistics here that are interesting on the science side. Between 1980 and 2006, the share of NIH, National Institute of Health grants, which is an important part of scientific funding in the US, worked by young scientists, meaning scientists up to their early 30s, fell by a whopping 90%. Let me repeat that. Between 1980 and 2006, the share of grants going to young scientists, are only 20-year-olds, I mean up to 35 scientists, fell by a whopping 90%. In 2007, in particular, there were more grants given to 70-year-old researchers than to researchers under 30. And I have also, research that I've done on Ivy League universities. I studied at Princeton, so that's the first thing I did. I went back to our alumni archives, and I also did it for other universities, and saw the trajectories of fellow students of mine, as well as younger alumni. And it's impressive to see how many, since I studied there in the early 80s, since that time, how many more of them, 10 years after they graduate, not immediately after they graduate, most of them, most of us, we go into engineering, medicine, law, what have you. 10 or 15 years later, many of them have gone into finance, right at the time where they can be most productive for the real economy. By the time they're 35, 40, they're into finance.